Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is fellow Forbes reporter Sarah Mueller. Sarah, thank you for coming on.
Yes, of course. I'm happy to talk about anything Iowa and politics with you.
Great. Two of my favorite subjects. As you said, we're talking about Iowa. There is a special segment we have coming up called the Eye on Iowa. Here now to prepare us for the Iowa caucus season. But before we get into the presidential hopefuls, let's talk about what people need to know about caucuses and Iowa in general.
We're in a really unique spot with the Iowa caucuses being debated as first in the nation or not. And we can get into more of some of the logistics on why that's still being debated, even though the Democrats stripped them of that title. But if we look at the history, it actually started in the 1970s when the Democrats were reevaluating their process. However, New Hampshire has their own law that requires them to go first for primaries. So, how are they going to get around that? Well, they came up with the Iowa caucuses as a result. And when we look at what the caucuses are, it actually deviates between the Democrats and the Republicans. So the Republicans are pretty straightforward. You come, you register, you make sure everybody's there. And then the different candidates, representatives will give a small speech, and then they will go around and they'll give their little votes, and then they'll deal with some more party kind of issues that they've got to get through, like delegates and so forth. Now, the Democratic process is actually kind of the more quote unquote fun one that people refer to, because it deals with moving around a room and kind of campaigning in a room. So you get there, you register, you go in, and you'll have all these different people representing different candidates. And they'll try and get you over on their side of the room and say, hey, come stand with us. You know, so and so has a great platform on prison reform or a great platform on the economy. And that's where the discussion starts happening. But when they all kind of settle into their different groups, and you'll see these things happening at like gyms or in school cafeterias. And so it's got to be a big open space for them to do this. And then what happens is they have to have 15% of the attendees to be able to be considered a viable candidate. So if, let's say, somebody has 10% of the attendees and they're not considered viable and they can't get any more people over to their corner of the room, that's when they'll do a realignment, which means those 10% of people either can cop out and go home, or they can go and maybe find another candidate that they want to go stand with. And that's when you start negotiating and you start saying, hey, this is where my candidate stands on this issue or that issue. So that's where it kind of gets a little bit more fun. Now, once all the presidential issues are kind of dealt with, then they go on to more party issues where they're talking about, you know, who do we want our delegates to be, yada, yada, so forth. Does that make sense?
That does make a lot of sense. I was in Iowa 3 years ago, so I did witness it firsthand. But you did mention there's a debate over the first in the nation status. Can you bring us up to speed about that?
Yeah, I mean, people have always questioned, why is Iowa first in the nation? You know, little itty bitty Iowa here in the Midwest. And there's a lot of reasons. But when we look back at 2020, they started this new kind of digital reporting system for the caucuses. Well, it turns out there was a bunch of issues with even just practicing using that software, in which they didn't practice, or, you know, there was a lot of issues around the technology of it that they hadn't panned out before the caucuses started. So then by the time the caucuses came around, there were so many errors, and then it took about 5 days for us to get a result. Well, that doesn't help when you're going into New Hampshire and you need that steam to go forward as a candidate. So that raised a lot of more questions. However, what we'll get into with the professor from the University of Iowa, Tim Hagle, who I spoke to, he says that there's kind of a lot of caveats. They can't just necessarily strip Iowa of our first in the nation status without consequences, because Iowa also has a law similar to New Hampshire that makes sure that we are first in the nation for caucuses. Now, there's one way that we could technically go about this to make everybody happy, and that's by having a caucus first, but not doing the presidential alignments and just doing caucus party kind of issues, you know, making sure we've got our delegates chosen, making sure we have our leadership chosen. And so then they can go and have a presidential kind of caucus later in the season. But that would be a huge, huge undertaking for the Democrats, and also a very costly one.
Who have been the recent caucus winners, and what has that done for the campaign? If you win in Iowa, is your campaign moving ahead at a rapid pace compared to other people who might not have performed as well at the caucuses?
That's a great question. And I think that's one that's been highly debated, Brittany, because one of the things that people kind of claim is that, well, I was trying to be a quote unquote kingmaker or queen maker, right? We're not. We're just trying to weed out the people who are pretenders and who are contenders. You know, who is going to be in for the long haul and who you should be paying attention to versus those who maybe don't have the gumption to move forward. And so what Iowa's role is in this campaign season is kind of, again, another question mark that we will be looking at if we lose this status officially. So when we're looking at some of the issues that they're going to bring forward, it's going to be those kitchen table issues. We have previously talked about this. What are people talking about in their homes almost daily, almost nightly at the kitchen table? The economy, inflation, anything else that you can possibly think of. That's what we will be asking on behalf of the nation to get us started for this campaign season.
Sarah, you said something that was really interesting. I actually just wrote it down. You said, who are the pretenders? Who are the contenders? You're a lifelong Iowan. You've participated in multiple caucuses. How can you weed them out?
That's a great point out, because I didn't even say that. That was Tim Hagle's analogy, because it's so perfect, right? We're not here to say this should be your next president. We're here to say, here are the really valid candidates that you have coming forward. And some of them we see obviously get weeded out very early on. We have people who drop in the middle of their campaign here in Iowa. So who makes it through, who doesn't? I don't know if there's a specific answer I can give on that, because each person is different. What people are looking for is different. However, what I can say is that ground game is important. We've seen candidates who come and throw up a couple of billboards, they throw up some ads on some local TV stations, but they don't put people in the communities to hear these issues, to talk to them, to have those living room conversations that we've discussed, like Jimmy Carter did. But, you know, then they don't go far. And you ask why? Well, they didn't put in the time and the effort. So really, we're going to see who cares, who wants to be here, who wants to hear the people out. And when we look at past candidates, I think you see Donald Trump spent a lot of time here in Iowa. And even after the election, when he was president, he did a couple of rallies here because he knew he had quite the roots here when he looked back on his campaign. And I think when we look at other candidates moving forward, it's kind of like, who can you attribute your win to? And I think Donald Trump knew that he got a lot of support here in Iowa.
You said that the ground game for any candidates so far this election season has not started yet, but what does that prep look like for a typical candidate in the past?
Yeah, there's a lot of volunteers necessary. And then how do you get volunteers? You get them because you have a good cause that you want them to get behind, right? So how are they going to reach out? How are they going to get those people involved in their causes that they're concerned about? Well, you have two people who are likely going to be incumbents. You have, first of all, Donald Trump, who's a former president. Obviously, like I said, he had pretty solid roots here in Iowa. He did win in Iowa in 2020, but he also came in second to Ted Cruz in 2016. However, you also look at possibly Biden running. And so when you have two incumbents who are possibly going to be running against each other, what is the rest of their party candidates going to be looking like? And how can they get their cause when they have such a big powerhouse running against them? So that's going to be the big question as we go into this next season.
To me, I'm putting my thinking cap on like I am a presidential hopeful right now. I would think it's a great time to go to Iowa. No one's there. Is that true? Are you seeing any ads? You're not seeing boots on the ground, but any ads either on the radio, on billboards, things like that?
No, we see nothing. And I think that's going to be kind of the point, right? Is, hey, we want you here. We want you giving us your cause. We want here to hear your platform, but no one's coming. And again, it comes down to, is Iowa going to be first in the nation or not? Should they divert and go to New Hampshire? Should they divert and go to another state where they're going to have more traction to get kickstarted? However, obviously, we know with the Republicans, they still have their caucus here. They've still stayed with the calendar. But as Tim Hagle has told me, we could run into what we're calling chaos calendar or calendar chaos. And that is just when pretty much everything's up in the air. We're not sure where to go and when to go there. And I think that's what probably a lot of candidates are running into right now.
Sarah, you mentioned two big names that we will see in Iowa potentially: former President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden. What about lesser names? How are they making their mark in Iowa?
I think that Iowa is a perfect place for if you don't have that household name yet. So you have the opportunity to lay a lot of groundwork in Iowa, get your name out. I mean, that's exactly how Jimmy Carter did it when he was running. He just started walking down the street, grabbing people's hands, shaking them and saying, you know, I'm Jimmy Carter and I'm running for president. And that did a lot for him. I mean, Iowans know a poser, right? We know when people are just coming and trying to lay a quick round and head out to New Hampshire. We know what we're looking for and we know what we're asking about. And one of the things that we kind of joke about, and maybe this isn't a trait that everybody looks for in their presidential hopeful, but can you have a beer with this person? Can you sit and talk to them about issues and just talk human to human about what's going on in our world? That's what they're looking for. And so some of these not as well-known candidates can make a lot of ground in Iowa if they just do the basics of that. Hear the issues. Sometimes there is this concept that if somebody's been in office for so long, they're kind of out of touch with what the average person is concerned about, those kitchen table issues. So just having those conversations and getting their name out is really an opportunity for some of those lesser known candidates.
Per usual, I always enjoy talking about Iowa with you, and I can't wait to continue this Eye on Iowa segment as we look forward to all things Iowa within the next year.
Thank you. And I hope you enjoy this interview with Dr. Hagle as we talk a little bit more about the process of the Iowa caucus. Thank you so much for joining me today. We have a lot to cover with this upcoming caucus season, but just to kind of get started, you know, I'm from Iowa. I totally understand how people can get kind of confused with our caucus process. Can you kind of explain where the caucus came from and how it runs?
Well, as far as where the caucus came from, it started with the Democrats back in 1972. And my understanding is that it was basically a response to some of the problems that the Democrats had with the 1968 elections and particularly their convention, things going on in Chicago and so forth. And so this was maybe a way to address some of the issues that were going on. So Iowa decided to get ahead of New Hampshire, which even then had the law in the books that they were the first primary. And by going first, they had to be a caucus rather than a primary. And so the following presidential cycle in 1976, the Republicans followed suit. And so the Democrats and Republicans went on the same day in the caucuses ahead of New Hampshire primary ever since. And of course, in 1976, it was also when Jimmy Carter, fairly unknown governor from Georgia at the time, came to the caucuses and decided to compete here. And because he went on to win the nomination and then the presidency, that it basically put the Iowa caucuses on the map, so to speak. And so that after that, candidates started to come to Iowa caucuses, and it sort of grew since then and became, as one academic put it, a media event, basically. So not only are the candidates coming here, but of course the media as well. So it's not something that's just isolated in as far as Iowa's activities. In terms of what happens in the caucuses, one of the things that I tell folks is that it's the caucus, we have caucus night and the results usually are announced on caucus night, but the process itself really begins at least a year out. And sometimes even more than that. To some extent, those of us that live in Iowa were almost subject to a perpetual campaign. And one of the stories that I tell is that after the day after the 2012 presidential election, I got my first question about the 2016 caucuses because somebody had come to Iowa or somebody was talking about Iowa or who's next kind of a thing. So we're always sort of thinking about it, but usually the activities begin in earnest again about a year out. And the reason for that is that you often have candidates that maybe don't have a lot of name recognition, and you have to put together a very good ground game usually to win in Iowa, that you need to identify your supporters because you're asking them to come out on a February or January evening on a Monday night and come out and express their support for you in a variety of ways. And that takes some energy to identify those folks and keep them energized and get them out. And so you need staffers, you need precinct captains, you need county chairs, you need outreach people for, farmer group, teacher group, all these different groups. And so it takes a long time to build that out, because you need those people, especially for the precinct captains, one of them in each of 1,700 precincts across the state of Iowa. So it takes a lot of work to find those people and do that. And that's why you need to start basically a year in advance. And again, if you're starting with somebody who doesn't have a lot of name recognition, maybe not a lot of resources, you start small and it gives you time to build out the campaign. For the candidates, it also gives them time to hone their message. That you may have somebody that usually has run for some other office, senator, governor, something like that. And so they may have some experience, of course, with campaigns. They may have a starter staff that they can bring over to Iowa to get things started, but they also need to hone their message to a national audience. They also need to maybe learn local issues, because of course they're talking to Iowa voters here. And although Iowans of course are paying attention to national issues as well, there are some things that are going to be specific to Iowa, particularly some agriculture issues, for example, or maybe something in one part of the state versus another part of the state. And so it gives those candidates that opportunity to see what kind of message, what are the issues, listen to the people. And that listen to the people aspect is particularly important for the Iowa caucuses, because once a campaign is well underway and you get past Super Tuesday and all of that, candidates don't have as much time to basically talk to people individually. Now you'll see them go down a rope line and have a quick chat with people and so on and so forth. But with the Iowa caucuses, the way it starts, and again, depends on the particular candidate, how much he or she has in terms of name recognition to start. But for a lot of candidates, they may meet with somebody in their living room. So you may have a half a dozen people, a dozen or more. The story with Jimmy Carter was that the first one was in somebody's living room with 3 people. Well, I'm not sure if that's true or not, but that's the idea, is that you give that opportunity for the candidate to talk to the people, as well as the people talking to somebody who could ultimately become the president of the United States. And so that exchange, I think, is important for a lot of potential campaigners, because they need to understand what the issues are that the people care about. They sometimes are in this little bubble, especially again, if they're an office holder already, that they may not understand that to the same extent, or at least not understand it in terms of how Iowans feel about this. And it's a good opportunity to do that. And then of course, this all builds to caucus night. And that's when you ask people to come and show up at a particular location, usually somewhere in their precinct, which means geographically close to where they're living, because that's how the precincts are divided up. So it could be a school room, it could be I was going to say a dorm, a meeting room or something of that nature for the students on campus, some community hall, something of that nature, where they just sort of get together and go through their process. Now, the process for Democrats is quite different than the process for Republicans, but the idea is still the same, where you show up, you support your candidate, you do some party business as well. In fact, we have caucuses every 2 years here, and the midterm caucuses are mainly party business, delegates to conventions and things of that nature. But again, on presidential years, you support the candidates, and then hopefully you tally them up and report the results. And then, of course, it gets a lot of media attention. And then the candidates and everybody runs off to New Hampshire or to the later states, Nevada, South Carolina, with the old order, to then deal with the contests in those states. Or sometimes candidates will go off even further down the line, because, of course, the candidates have to have campaigns well underway in, for example, New Hampshire, because you can't put a campaign together in just 8 days. And so as a matter, they have to have campaigns starting here, then get them going in New Hampshire as well, and the other states down the line. And that'll be true for Democrats with the new order as well.
Now, I want to take a real big step back, and just for, our viewers who have not been to Iowa, they've never been to a caucus, they don't understand. If you show up on caucus night as a Republican or as a Democrat, what is that process like for them?
Well, as far as the people who've never been to Iowa, come to Iowa. It's a nice place. We'll welcome you with open arms. But in terms of the caucuses and how this works, that again, there are some variations, but there are also similarities between what the Democrats and the Republicans do. So in both cases, well before caucus night, you have the parties, usually the county parties will have to set up the locations where the precincts will meet. And so again, that varies. The more rural counties have more fewer precincts, larger geographically. So, you know, the local town hall or whatever it happens to be. In a bigger place, like again, where I am in Johnson County with the University of Iowa, or in Polk County, where the capital of Des Moines is, that you would have many more precincts because of the higher population concentration. And so the county party there would set that up and arrange for where they can be. Again, a lot of schools and churches, basements and things of that nature, any place where there maybe is a big meeting hall. Or again, here, fortunately for the University of Iowa, sometimes they can have big dorms and things, big dorm rooms, rooms in dorms and in other class buildings that happen to be free at the time. So you come in and basically announce all of these locations ahead of time. So the parties have to make sure that everybody, all the voters know where this is. And so it's publicized in advance. And of course, the representatives from the various campaigns are making sure that the people that have signed support cards are notified, give them rides, things of that nature to make sure everybody can get there and get prepared. So when the people do come to their precinct location where their caucus is being held, the first thing they have to do is check in. And both parties have lists of the registered voters in their particular precinct. And so these lists are up to date within about a week or two of the caucus night. And the thing is that people will keep registering right up until caucus night. And so the list may not be entirely accurate. And again, you have to be living in that precinct to participate in that particular caucus. And you also have to be registered for that party to participate in that party's caucus. So you have to be registered Democrat for the Democrats caucus, Republican for the Republican. If you're not on that list, then you have to re-register. So if, again, it may be that you're changing parties, and maybe you changed addresses. And so sometimes that can take a long time. Again, one of the things that often happens is you have a lot of no party voters, what Iowa calls its independents, that want to register and participate in, you know, one of the party's caucuses for the Democrats or for the Republicans. And so it takes time to get them registered. And again, more people that are trying to do this, the more time it takes. And sometimes I've heard stories where the caucuses don't actually get underway until like an hour and a half after the official start time, just because of so many people that needed to register. Once they get registered, then they come in. And here's where you start to see a difference between the two parties. For the Republicans, it's pretty straightforward in terms of you'll have somebody that's the caucus chair, and that person then it's temporary, and that person then has to get voted on to be the permanent chair and have a permanent secretary. That basically that's the person running the meeting, running the caucus. And then you'll have representatives of the campaigns that are running in that particular caucus give a short speech, usually 2 or 3 minutes. Hopefully at that point, the voters are pretty well aware of the candidates because they've shown up hopefully to support a particular candidate. And then they vote. Again, either pre-printed ballots or sometimes just on slips of paper. The votes are counted up, tallied, and then sent in. And now Republicans, given that they had a problem back in 2012 with counting issues, that they have an app on the phone where whoever either the caucus secretary or the caucus chair is simply able to enter the numbers into this app and hit send, and it goes off. And it gets tallied pretty quickly, and it's worked great the last 2 caucuses. For Democrats, it's similar to the extent that you may have some speechifying going on, or basically candidates, representatives are talking to people, trying to get some last minute supporters, making sure all their people are there and so forth. And then at a certain point, they cast a vote, or actually they may not cast an actual vote, that they basically have to get up and walk around the room, and people count up how many people support this candidate, how many people support this other candidate, and so forth. And that's where they start with, okay, you have to have at least 15% of the people there supporting a candidate before that candidate is considered viable. And the purpose of this is basically say, well, look, we want people that are contenders rather than the pretenders kind of a thing. And if you can't get 15% support in your caucus, then we're just going to say, folks, you need to pick your second choice in that type of situation. So then they have a period of realignment. And that's where you're starting to talk and negotiate and say, hey, join our group, that group. You may have two candidates, maybe that each have 10%. They say, hey, let's get together and support one of these two, and then we'll have 20% will be viable. So you get some negotiating going on and so forth. And then you have another count. And that's where, again, you make sure what the numbers are and so forth. And once you finally do that, and again, this last time for 2020, Democrats only had one realignment. In the past, they'd have a second one as well. So again, that would just take longer. And again, sometimes this can be in a very crowded room when they have to branch out and something go down the hall and so forth for their group of people. And keeping those folks together can be a bit of a chore. But after the realignment, especially the first one is done, then they count up again. And at that point, you have the numbers that get reported. And how they report them, again, this was a bit of a problem in 2020 that the system broke down to some extent and the numbers weren't getting counted or didn't come in quickly enough. And so this was a problem. But the other thing that goes on here too is you have to convert those actual numbers of people that support a candidate into those state delegate equivalents. And there's a whole mathematical formula for that I just don't recall right off the top of my head. But the idea is that now they were reporting, or at least in 2020, they started to report both numbers. So they reported the raw vote, but also those state delegate equivalents, and hopefully get it in. Of course, in 2020 for the Democrats, it didn't get it in. All the precincts weren't able to get it in on time, and that caused some of the confusion as a result. After all of that is taken care of, then the candidate vote in one way or another, both for Democrats and Republicans, then you move on to party business. And that's where you're electing people to the or not the state, but the county central committee, delegates to the county convention, and things of that nature. So you move on to party business. And that's where a lot of people will not be as interested in that. So you often have a large number of people that leave once the presidential aspect is over.
There's a lot of game to be played on the Iowa field. However, we saw a totally different process in 2020 based on the reporting system for the Democrats. Can you just, for context, go through what happened in 2020?
I can't dig into the details too much. I can basically look at this from sort of the observer's point of view. And you essentially have two things going on. The first is that the way the Democrats run or report the information is a little more complicated than Republicans. For the Republican side, basically, they go in, they take a vote, a little ballot that sometimes are pre-printed, sometimes just slips of paper. You write the person's name on it, count them up, turn them in, and that's basically it as far as that aspect of the caucuses is concerned. You go on to party business. For Republicans, it's a more involved process because they have preference groups, and you have to reach a certain threshold to maintain support. And so there's a realignment that occurs. And at least as far as the process in 2020, they tried to streamline it to a certain extent, that they only had one of these realignment aspects where, again, if you don't reach that threshold of 15%, then your candidate was considered not viable and you had to maybe join somebody else, or some people would just leave the caucuses at that point if they couldn't find a second choice. And so the Democrats tried to streamline that a little bit. They also had some problems back in 2016 in terms of how are they reporting the numbers. That for the Democrats, it had been that they were reporting what are called state delegate equivalents. So it wasn't the straight vote and how many people, in each precinct voted for the various candidates. It was then put through this calculation to determine these delegates. And that made some people unhappy. Bernie Sanders in particular was concerned that he had actually won the vote, even though Hillary Clinton narrowly won the state delegate equivalent. So the next year they said, okay, we'll report both numbers. And so the reporting things had changed. They were using some new technology to try to get the numbers in as quickly as possible, to make sure, of course, for the media in particular, that they would have results that they could report, again, so that the candidates would kind of know what happened to their campaign in terms of how they ranked, and then again move on to New Hampshire very quickly, even that evening. And unfortunately, the system failed, and the backup system failed. The phone lines were jammed, they didn't work, information couldn't get through. And basically, we didn't know who won the caucuses until several days later. And really, at that point, it was past anybody really caring, because if you're going to win the caucuses in Iowa and get a bounce, you really need that right away so that you can go into New Hampshire with a head of steam. To some extent, that may have worked to Biden's advantage because he ended up fourth in Iowa. And so fourth would have been very bad if we had known that caucus night. It may have hurt his campaign even more. Of course, he only finished fifth in New Hampshire anyway, so maybe it would have made too much difference. But still, not having those results caucus night really was a problem. And it was something that, again, Democrats had tried to avoid given the problem they had the previous cycle, but ended up that they had additional problems that just were unforeseeable. And I will say that one of the things that we've heard about this is that they had tried to make some other changes earlier in the year to try to smooth out the process, but there were concerns from the national party, the DNC, that for security purposes, in terms of things like absentee voting or phone-in voting, things of that nature. And the DNC said, no, we don't want you to do that. And so it basically put the Iowa Democrats in a more difficult position, had to go back to what they had been doing before, and it just didn't work out for them.
So there's a lot of things I want to break down from your answer, one of which being, what credibility does the Iowa caucuses have? Do the Iowa caucuses have on the whole nation? I mean, when you're talking about Joe Biden's and the impact of the Iowa caucus on his campaign, I mean, why should we be first in the nation, or why should we not be first in the nation?
Yeah, that's a pretty standard question. And as you might imagine, that every presidential cycle, we always get these questions: why Iowa? Why should Iowa go first? And all of that. And the criticisms vary over the years. And of course, they became more intense, particularly for the Democrats, for a combination of the two problems that the Democrats had in reporting the results in 2016 and 2020, but also some demographic issues as well. But one of the things that I usually tell people is, look, Iowa's purpose in the Iowa caucuses is not to pick the nominee, not to be kingmaker. What our role is to separate the contenders from the pretenders. So we have a lot of people, as most people following the campaigns will know, that will maybe start a campaign, they'll declare for the presidency, they'll get in some of those early debates long before the caucuses even, and you kind of have to wonder, what chance do you really have? Now, again, you never know. It could be somebody that comes out of nowhere, like I said, an unknown governor from maybe a southern state. You can think of Jimmy Carter, you can think of Bill Clinton, that you wouldn't have normally given them much of a chance early on. But still, because they campaigned early and got in the race and got their voice out there and seemed to be maybe the best candidate, that seemed to be a good thing ultimately. And in fact, at least in those two examples, they did win the presidency. And so there are also going to be a lot of people that do drop out, and they'll drop out long before the caucuses because it's clear that their message isn't resonating. They aren't able to find support to put together a ground game. They don't get donors to give money to the campaign so that they can hire staff to do the things that are necessary, not just here in Iowa, but then again down the road, because again, you've got to be building your campaign, not just here in Iowa, but in New Hampshire and the other states as well. And it's pretty early on that it's clear that they're just not resonating with the people, particularly the people here in Iowa, but others that are watching the process unfold here as well. And so that's an important part of the process here, that basically making that separation so that by the time we do get to the caucuses, you have a much smaller number of people. Now, having said that, there were still quite a few people on the Democrat side in 2020. And sometimes that can cause problems because you may have a popular candidate and then the other candidates split the vote in some ways so that any kind of serious opposition to it doesn't occur. But, aside from sort of specific things about any given race, it's still a good process in terms of forcing those candidates to actually talk to people and get out and campaign. And that's one of the things that, again, is a value from Iowa, not just for Iowans in terms of our ability to talk to these candidates, but for the nation as a whole. And part of that, and this is usually a criticism of Iowa too, is the idea that we're too small. Why don't you start in a bigger state? Well, again, in a smaller state, it gives those candidates that maybe don't have that name recognition or don't have that financial backing or resources initially, gives them a chance too. Maybe they've got a good message. Maybe this is somebody that really is good or would be a good leader, but just hasn't had the opportunity or doesn't have that name recognition. And so coming to Iowa, a small state, especially a state that doesn't require a lot of money from media attention when it comes down to it. Again, a lot of it early isn't so much the media side of things, but it does ramp up, of course, like any campaign when it gets close to caucus day. And so if you're starting in a huge state, you don't have the resources, so those candidates are going to be left out, and it's only going to be more established candidates. And maybe that's a good thing in some instances, but in other instances, maybe not.
Now, obviously, we've been talking about the first in the nation status, and Democrats have revoked that. Republicans are still in the game, but what is the long-term impact of Democrats stepping back from Iowa?
Well, let me twist that question just a little bit, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Now, in terms of what the DNC voted for, which was the proposal put forth by the Rules and Bylaws Committee, is that Iowa's out, that it's not among the first, and we would undoubtedly be penalized in some way if we still went first for the Democrats. Of course, Republicans are going to stick to the old calendar. So for the Democrats, the problem that they face is a combination of the fact that Iowa has a law that says that the caucuses have to be before the primary in New Hampshire, the first primary, which again would normally be in New Hampshire, just as New Hampshire has a law saying that it's the first primary. And that's part of the problem that we have right now, is that the Democrats have voted, the DNC has voted this particular order, but it's not clear that that's going to be the final order. Part of the reason for that, again, New Hampshire has a law that says they're the first primary. And the only reason that Iowa's caucuses were before that is because it was a caucus, not a primary. And that's one of the sticking points for Iowa, is that the Democrats prefer primaries at this point rather than caucuses, which is one of the reasons why Nevada, which used to have a caucus, switched to a primary to get around that particular problem. But New Hampshire has its law on the books. It wants to go first. Georgia apparently is not particularly thrilled with entering the early lineup, that especially given that they have a number of Republican officials, and they don't want to be in a particular position of having two separate primaries, because that's a big expense on the state. And so if the Republicans want to have their primary at the time they normally would, it'll force the Democrats to do so too. And basically at this point, there are two states that may not be part of that system. So Iowa still is out of it, but we don't know what's going to happen to the others. Now, Iowa, as I said, has a law where our caucuses go ahead of any primary. The thing is, though, that the way the law is written is it doesn't require any kind of presidential preference vote or poll. And so it has to involve party activities. So selecting delegates to county conventions, members of the county central committee, things of that nature. And so the Democrats could separate those two things, which might be a little bit tricky, but they could have the preference poll, or where they're voting on who they want to be their nominee at some later point. And that would satisfy the state law and perhaps satisfy the DNC, but it might be more cumbersome for Iowa Democrats. And we just don't know what's going to happen with that at this point. We also, again, because of those uncertainties, that it basically creates the potential for what many have called calendar chaos, meaning we just don't know how this is all going to shake out. And at this point, like I have said, where normally we would be well underway, or at least the beginnings of well underway in the caucus process, a year out from the caucuses. So we're into early February at this point as I'm talking to you, and normally we would have candidates coming in and so forth. Now, this is an odd year for two reasons. One, of course, what's going on with the Democrats, but even for the Republicans, because Donald Trump, a former president, has declared other candidates seem to be holding back. So things are starting a little more slowly. But in any case, because of the Democrats wanting to change the calendar, we don't know how that's going to unfold. And if there are changes later on, some of the changes might not occur until as late as June. That's apparently when the DNC has set the next deadline for these states, such as New Hampshire and Georgia, to do something to try to correct the problems that the DNC sees about this. And so we would expect to be underway at this point, and we don't know what candidates might have that opportunity to join the race. Now, to some extent, that may not be as big a deal this year, because if President Biden decides to run for re-election, we wouldn't expect much action on the Democrats' side unless he was challenged, and we don't see anybody along those lines, but it would be something like what happened to Jimmy Carter in 1980, where Ted Kennedy decided to challenge him. Of course, Carter still won, but it was pretty clear, given the economy and things going on at that time, that he wasn't going to win the general election. And of course, he didn't. And maybe if some people feel that Biden might not win the general election for whatever reason, that maybe some Democrats would be willing to challenge to make the race a little more interesting. But if he's not challenged, and if Biden does run again, then it does give the Democrats a little bit of a cushion to work out the kinks and in the new order this year when there's not as much on the table. And hopefully they get it sorted out by the 2028 election cycle. Having said all that, whatever the Democrats decide to do, it may also affect what the Republicans decide to do. Because now here in Iowa, if the two parties don't have a caucus on the same day, it's not critical. It's been a little confusing potentially. And especially given that we have same-day voter registration here in Iowa, there's that potential where people could end up participating in both caucuses. And one of the things that we do know here in Iowa is that our independents, which we call no-party voters here in Iowa, many of them changed their voter registration to participate in the caucuses, either for the Democrats or for the Republicans. And in fact, in 2008, when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and John Edwards were vying for the nomination in the potentially historic nature of Obama or Clinton winning, that you had a huge surge of people that were no party voters that changed their voter registration to participate in the Democrats' caucuses. So those folks, if they wanted to, they could say, well, if Republicans and Democrats are not going to have their caucuses on the same night, maybe we'll try for both of them so we can get the candidate we think would be best for both parties. And there would be nothing to stop them or other party members from sort of switching back if they so choose. Now, again, it's not so much that it's any kind of nefarious activity. It just may be that, well, hey, I want to participate. I want to see what's going on. I want to be part of this as well. So there's that particular problem. And plus, we may have a situation here in Iowa where, again, with the Republicans, if they see, well, okay, Democrats have said that South Carolina goes first. So rather than come to Iowa, they may go to South Carolina and campaign and spend a little more time there because Iowa seems to be on the outs, at least as far as the Democrats are concerned. And so they'll get perhaps more media attention coming to South Carolina. One other twist to this, there are always these twists to these things, is, of course, for the Republicans with Donald Trump running, that he is basically the favorite at this point, partly because he's mainly the only person in the race. Apparently, John Bolton said that he's interested. We know a few other candidates that have had their name thrown around, Pompeo, Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis in Florida, governor of Florida. So we have to see who actually joins the race. But at least right now, if Trump's in and if Trump seems to be dominating the race, again, it may be a situation almost like we had two incumbents running. And so it may be a slow year for Republicans as well. Time will tell.
There's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts in there. I am really curious, though. It sounds like a lot of people are just waiting for something else to happen to make a decision. So I'm curious, when do you think that we're going to have more decisions made about if Iowa's going to actually hold their caucus? And is there going to be separate dates? Who are we waiting on for that?
We're waiting on a lot of people to make decisions. Many of them are outside of meaning Iowa folks' hands. Again, what we know is that Georgia seems to be reluctant to change, or at least it doesn't want to be in a situation of potentially having to hold two different primaries. And so that would seem to require that the Democrats go when the Republicans go, which is later in the calendar. So that may mean that they're no longer going to be part of the early system. So will some other state take their place? We don't know. New Hampshire Democrats have pushed back hard, much harder than Iowa Democrats have, in terms of saying, look, we've got a state law. This is the way we've done it in their case for 100 years. And they want to go first, and they're not happy about it. And they've been granted until June to sort of sort this out, but it doesn't look like they're going to. And they're probably going to be willing to take some sort of hit in terms of having their delegate count cut in half, for example, or something like that, rather than make a change, because they really can't at this point. It's probably not possible for them to change the state law. For Iowa, one of the things that was proposed early on for the caucuses was that instead of having, and this has been a complaint in terms of how the caucuses themselves work, was that there may be too crowded, especially in precincts where you have a very huge concentration of Democrats. So some of the urban precincts where I am in Johnson County with the University of Iowa in particular, where Democrats have a majority of voters in the county, outnumber Republicans 2-1, the precincts can be very crowded and very chaotic. And so one of the things that Democrats have pushed for, and partly this is because they prefer primaries rather than caucuses where you have to show up, is some sort of early voting option. So they were thinking about having a mail-in system where well prior to the caucus night, that they would have this opportunity to mail in a card with their preference on it, and those would just be tallied up and announced on caucus night. Well, if that occurs on caucus night, then it would seem that they would still violate the DNC's new calendar. And so they would have to push that back to some later point. And again, it's not clear what Iowa Democrats want to do about that. Maybe they're still waiting to see if perhaps they can slide into one of the early states. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that even if New Hampshire gets censured in some way, that it would still go first, that it would still plan on going first because that's what their state law says. Georgia could drop out, but then we're back to 4 early states, which is what we had before, rather than the 5 that the DNC has proposed. And so, yeah, there are just a lot of question marks at this time. And the problem with that, aside from anything else, is that it doesn't give any kind of certainty. So if you have candidates who are thinking, whether it's on the Democratic side or the Republican side, if they're thinking about perhaps launching a campaign, that it's a big question mark because they're not really sure. Normally they would say, okay, this is the state to go first. We'll go to Iowa, we'll get set up. We'll go to New Hampshire, we'll get set up, and the other early states. And at this point, they just aren't sure. They could go to South Carolina because that's going to be in the early window regardless. It's just not exactly clear what the date will be. But what about Georgia? What about Michigan? Is it going to be part of this too? Do they go there? And again, we just don't know at this point.